Wait, say that again? He didn't mention Bradley's name. Not once, the whole thing. But Bradley runs a whole army group. Okay, well, how does Bradley feel about that? Ouch. January 13th, 1945. Adolf Hitler has been getting warnings lately from a variety of people, even heavy hitters like Heinz Guderian, that the Soviets are planning an enormous January offensive. Hitler dismissed all that as fantasy, but this week, that fantasy becomes reality because this week, the Soviets attack. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, preparations were being made for American landings on Luzon. In Europe, the Germans tried and failed to break the siege of Budapest, and the struggle for the city itself also continued. The Battle of the Bulge continued in the west, ever more in the Allies' favor. The Germans launched a new offensive in Alsace, and there was big tension in Allied high command, threatening their unity, especially issues between British Commander Bernard Montgomery and Allied Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower. I mentioned last week that Monty planned to hold a press conference this week on the 7th to explain how the Germans have been defeated in the Ardennes, and it was the result of Allied teamwork, and to quash any notion in the British press that there were any American failures there. There were quite a few people worried that this would not go well. Well, this is what happens. Dressed, according to war correspondent Alan Moorhead, like a clown, in a parachute harness and a maroon beret, Montgomery meets the press at Zonhoven. He does praise Eisenhower as Allied leader, and he does praise the American soldiers, who actually have done the lion's share of the fighting in the Ardennes the past few weeks. But he also spends an awful lot of time talking about his own brilliance and his own role in the proceedings. This is a piece of his talk quoted in Rick Atkinson's The Guns at Last Light. As soon as I saw what was happening, I took certain steps myself to ensure that if the Germans got to the Meuse, they would certainly not get over that river. And I carried out certain movements so as to provide balanced dispositions. I was thinking ahead. The battle has been most interesting. I think possibly one of the most interesting and tricky battles I have ever handled. Well, the reporters file their stories, and a lot of the British officers are upset that Monty was indecently exultant. Montgomery's chief of staff, Freddie de Guingen, calls it, "What a good boy am I, self-regard." The Daily Mail then writes, "Montgomery foresaw attack, acted on own to save day." Winston Churchill's private secretary writes, "Monty's triumphant, jingoistic, and exceedingly self-satisfied talk to the press on Sunday has given wide offense." The U.S. 9th Army War Diary, 9th Army has been temporarily under Monty's command for the fight, writes, "He sees fit to assume all the glory and scarcely permits the mention of an army commander's name. That is true, but not just Army. He does not even mention American 12th Army Group Commander Omar Bradley at all." One British general then reports that Bradley's contempt for Montgomery has now grown into outright hatred. And Eisenhower's deputy, Air Marshal Arthur Tedder, writes in his diary that cooperation between Bradley and Monty is now out of the question. I got those quotes and bits from the Atkinson book, by the way. Good book. Once again, Eisenhower is forced to mediate and calm the whole storm and keep everyone, Monty, Bradley, everyone, focused on the task at hand, which is clearing the Germans from the Ardennes, which is not nearly as completed as Montgomery implies. In fact, they have 8 Panzer and 20 infantry divisions still there. But George Patton's U.S. 3rd Army offensive from the south and Monty's offensive from the north are slowed down by fog and snow. Bridges have been blown, bad weather keeps Allied air power grounded, and the casualties creep up by the thousands as both North and South pincers grind their way towards Uffalise. But neither one reaches it this week. Now, German Army Group Commander Walter Model asked Adolf Hitler last week if he could withdraw from the west of the Bulge, and this week on the 8th, Hitler allows it, though it is a plodding withdrawal that takes place over the rest of the week. The chief military reasons for the failure of the German offensive in the Ardennes are to be found in the mistaken assessment of the situation at various command levels. If the Germans had assessed their opponent's potential strength at all realistically, they would soon have realized how senseless this enterprise was. The fact that the Germans regard the Allied air superiority as no more than a marginal problem is merely one particular example of these mistaken assessments. OB West and Army Group B staff officers obviously took little note of what had been learned about Allied tactics and warfare since the Normandy landing. Just as the Germans underestimated the strength of their opponent, they also overestimated their own capabilities. Guts, recklessness, and the resolve to win could not in themselves make up for the lack of leadership. Military expertise and professionalism gradually came to take second place. Instead, the soldiers were to be inspired by a fanaticism that would persuade them to fight and die for their Führer. But that isn't the only offensive the Germans are fighting in the West. Their Alsace offensive, Operation Nordwind, launched as the year begins, continues. Actually, there's a new operation down here dreamed up by Heinrich Himmler in the works. This is called Sonnenwende, Solstice, and is to support Nordwind with attacks from the Colmar pocket south of Strasbourg, while attacks also go off from the Rhine north of Strasbourg. Himmler wants to retake the city and present it to Hitler on the 12th anniversary of his rise to power on January 30th. North of the city, the Germans established a Gansheim bridgehead late last week, and Sonnenwende is launched now on the 8th. They do push back the French south of Erstein, but they re-establish their line along the Ill River by the 12th, and the operation overall is a failure, though they create a little bulge. This failure, though, causes Himmler to change his plans, and instead of taking Strasbourg, he now wants to cut off U.S. Sixth Corps near Ogenau. This leads to a week of back-and-forth fighting around Atten, with the Allies manning Maginot Line forts along the approaches there. It is indecisive at this week's end. The Germans have been playing both offense and defense lately as well over in Hungary. Last week, German reserves managed to stop any further Soviet advances in the area between the Hron and Nitra rivers, though the Germans themselves were unable to break through to Budapest to relieve the siege there. There is an attempt this week, the 7th to the 11th, by 3rd Panzer Corps south of Moor to try to link up with German forces north of Bichke, but this fails at the cost of a lot of German tanks. The Germans now plan a third attack, but this will be different. The plan is to try to cut Fyodor Tolbuchin's 3rd Ukrainian front in half. It's a deception plan. Herbert Gille's 4th SS Panzer Corps withdraws to the base in Komarno and boards trains like it's heading west. The Soviets do not pursue a beaten enemy who's leaving the area. However, the real German plan is for that Panzer Corps to make their way south to southwest of Székesfehérvár and attack next week. So they travel mountain roads covered in snowdrifts to the northern tip of Lake Balaton, unknown to the Soviets. In Budapest itself, the situation is still developing, and the fighting is still brutal. So this week, on the 10th, the Soviet General Staff asks 2nd Ukrainian Front Commander Rodion Malinovsky why he has no unified direction of the forces actually doing the fighting, which he doesn't, and suggests establishing a Budapest combat group directly under front command. This is established the next day under Ivan Afonin, 18th Independent Guards Corps commander. The combat group's immediate task is a two-pronged attack to cut the Pest defenses in half and reach the Danube. The struggle for the city does increase in intensity this week, with the Soviets advancing through holes blasted in buildings instead of along the narrow streets swept by the German guns. German tanks try to fight in the open spaces and parks, but they're running out of fuel and ammunition. On the 12th, the Soviets take the racecourse, which cuts the fuel supply line for the German garrison. They then take Varusliget Park today, the 13th. You should realize that with house-to-house fighting, fires cannot be put out and the dead cannot be buried, which leads to the whole city covered with a nauseating stench of decay, death, and burning bodies. But aside from the war in Hungary, there are some Germans quite concerned with the whole Eastern Front. This week on the 9th, Heinz Guderian once again meets with Adolf Hitler to try to convince him that there is a very real threat there, that the Soviets are going to launch an enormous offensive, even a series of offensives. This is based on Reinhard Gehlen's intelligence reports. The Fuhrer rounded on Guderian in a fury and described Galen's reports as completely idiotic. The place for the man who compiled such drivel was a lunatic asylum. In a matching rage, Guderian refused Hitler's demand that Galen be relieved of his duties, at which the storm passed. But nothing further could be done to bolster the German armies in the east. 3 days later, on January 12th, those lunatic ravings turn out not to be so loony when the gigantic Soviet offensive not only goes off, but grows in scale hour by hour. We had an extra episode the other day that goes over the actual plans for the offensive, so check that out if you missed it. At 5 a.m., Ivan Konev's 1st Ukrainian front begins its artillery barrage, with as many as 300 big guns per kilometer of the front, as the recon battalions advance. They take the first line of German trenches and then go to ground so the artillery can blast further ahead. For nearly 2 solid hours. This completely smashes up the mobile reserves of the Germans. Remember, a couple weeks ago, when I said Hitler rejected the idea of having the main battle line several kilometers behind the front line? Yeah, well, the chickens come home to roost now because the mobile reserves are all bunched up near the front line and are badly savaged. At 1:50 p.m., Dmitry Lelyushenko asks to let loose his 4th Tank Army. Konev gives him the go, and the 6th Guards and 10th Tank Corps blast off, each with a regiment attached of the heavy IS Stalin tanks with 122mm guns. Within an hour, they're in action against the German tactical reserves. By the evening, Konev's infantry have broken through on a 40-kilometer front to a depth of 20 kilometers, and Lelyushenko's units have advanced over 30. By the end of today, they've reached the Nida, as has Pukhov's 13th Army, on a broad front. And those 2 armies, as well as 3rd Guards Tank Army, are closing in on Kielce. And on top of that, Konev now sends his left wing, driving for Krakow. Ivan Cherniakovsky's 3rd Belarusian Front also launches an offensive today, the 13th, up at the border of East Prussia. The final objective is Königsberg, but they are to basically try to destroy the enemy north of the Masurian Lakes. This I will talk about next week, for there is more stuff to cover just now. For one thing, there are the American landings on Luzon in the Philippines. The Allies have like 1,000 ships in Lingayen Gulf for the landings on the 9th. A lot of them loaded with troops. So the kamikaze fear level is pretty high. Kamikazes do attack, but their numbers have dwindled. They damaged 2 cruisers, causing 92 casualties aboard the Columbia. 1 more hits battleship Mississippi, 86 casualties. And friendly fire shooting at kamikazes manages to hit battleship Colorado and kills the whole air defense team. As for the landings themselves, Operation Mike 1, it is by Walter Kruger's 6th Army. Innes Swift's 1st Corps lands from Task Force 78 ships around San Fabian. The assault units are from the 43rd and 6th Infantry Divisions. Oscar Griswold's 14th Corps lands from Task Force 79 ships around Lingayen Village. Assault units are from the 37th and 40th Divisions. Task Force 38 gives cover for the landings by attacking targets on Formosa and Okinawa, together with super fortresses from Chinese air bases. Japanese Commander Tomoyuki Yamashita in North Luzon has decided not to contest the actual landings, so the Japanese don't interfere the first 2 days. Yamashita has like 150,000 or so men directly under his command as the Shobu group in northern Luzon, but also like 110,000 more to the south, 30,000 in the Kembu group south and west of Lingayen guarding the airfields, and 80,000 in the Shembu group defending Manila and the southeast peninsula. Yamashita, with more than 250,000 troops and plenty of supplies and ammunition at his disposal, was ready with a well-planned defense in depth. Rather than waste his tanks and soldiers in an all-out effort to hurl the invaders back into the sea, he has concentrated his forces in 3 powerful groups inland. His intention was to let the Americans get ashore, then encircle and crush them. His basic plan is to avoid fighting in the open Central Valley, where American air power and coordinated artillery would be a huge advantage, and make the enemy come to him in the broken mountainous country bordering the valley. Those 3 groups carefully deployed. By the evening of the 9th, more than 50,000 Americans have come ashore and have linked up to form a solid beachhead 6 kilometers deep. Douglas MacArthur walks ashore for the cameras and the cheering local crowd. From the 10th, Griswold's job is to push south and free Manila, while Swift secures his rear and his flank from enemy assaults. On the 11th, the U.S. 25th Division, Kruger's Reserve, and an armored group land. The first fighting inland begins, but still, by the end of the week, the American buildup and the drive inland have met with very little heavy opposition, though the drive up the coast that finds De Mortis deserted the 12th does get pushed back today by an ambush when continuing the advance. Today, the 13th, the escort carrier Salomawa is damaged by kamikaze. Such attacks are indeed rarer, as most of the planes have been either lost or withdrawn, though their enemy isn't fully aware of that. However, today the 13th, kamikaze attacks in the Gulf and along the convoy route stop. From December 13th to January 13th, the Japanese have lost 600 planes, around 200 of them suicide attacks. On the Allied side here, 24 ships have been sunk, 30 badly damaged, and 37 have minor damage. They've also taken 4,000 or so casualties. From its attacks in the Lingayen battles, usually accompanied by escort planes, the Kamikaze Corps had been developing tactics that it would use in the coming battles. For example, the pilots would aim to hit the sides of ships at the waterline, except battleships with their protective armor, or the flight decks of carriers in order to break into the interior of the ship and explode their bombs, destroying machinery and piping, starting fires, and flooding the ship. Another frequent target was the bridge, the source of command and controls. To confuse gunners, the planes would come in low, weaving back and forth, and then abruptly rise and veer towards a different target. The kamikaze attack was a matter of deep concern to the American Navy. So sudden and devastating, it could paralyze the gun crews in the face of what was a sort of guided missile or torpedo. Air defense must now strive to eliminate all of them, not just most of them. Defense strategies against them have changed, too. Allied Naval Command says lots of maneuvering is wrong. Ships should stay their course and ready their guns. Also, and contrary to what might seem logical, a ship at a right angle to a kamikaze is actually a slimmer target. The plane isn't firing guns, right? And it's more likely to miss hitting the ship because of range overshooting or undershooting it than it is because of deflection, like if it hit the ship at a narrow angle and bounced along it. Still, the planned landings on Iwo Jima are only weeks away, with Okinawa set for the start of April, and escort carriers, battleships, and cruisers keep getting sunk or knocked out of action, and they can take months to fix. What if the Japanese send waves of kamikazes in the hundreds? Well, the Allies are not going to withdraw or stop their operations. And it turns out they didn't really even need the cruisers or battleships at Luzon, since the landings are unopposed. We will see how opposition develops next week. Another Allied operation is developing this week. Okay, back on December 19th, 14th Army Commander Bill Slim had explained his revised plan for Operation Extended Capital to his corps commanders Montague Stopford and Frank Messervy. The updated plan called for completely beating the Japanese in Burma and taking Rangoon by May, whereas before it was just defeating them in the central region. I've gone over this before, but the idea is for 33rd Corps to cross the Irrawaddy aiming at Mandalay, where Haitaro Kimura thinks they're going to attack, while secretly sending 4th Corps south to take Maiktila. The supply line from Rangoon up to Mandalay runs through Maiktila, and Japanese 15th and 33rd armies rely on that line, so the Japanese cannot hold Mandalay without it. Such a move would also nearly surround the enemy. The Japanese armies in the north were like the extended fingers of a hand, with Maiktila its wrist. In Slim's words, crush that wrist, no blood would flow through the fingers, the whole hand would be paralyzed. It's planned to be another case of hammer and anvil. The question, of course, is how do you move an entire army corps with tanks through jungle without the enemy finding out about it? Why? with a huge deception campaign, of course. We saw last month that they've set up a dummy 4th Corps headquarters with radio and signals, and plenty of fake radio traffic for the Japanese to listen to. 19th Division has been temporarily assigned from 4th Corps to 33rd as well. So it looks like the 2 Corps are cooperating, and 33rd Corps orders are to keep up constant pressure in the north. So Kimura thinks he's facing both corps. RAF planes will patrol constantly to make sure that no Japanese recon planes spot 4th Corps on its journey. There's also something of a deception within a deception. Since Gangao is fairly well defended, it is to be destroyed by a massive aerial bombardment followed by an attack by the Lushai Brigade. These are sort of like the Chindits were, a long-range loose cannon group who are never deployed alongside regular infantry. So obviously, if they're attacking, then it's not a major offensive move. There are really 3 stages for each corps' plans: getting to the Irrawaddy, crossing the Irrawaddy, and the battles for Mandalay and Maiktila. 2nd, 19th, and 20th Divisions from 33rd Corps have been on the move, with 2nd and 19th racing for Schwebo. Advanced patrols reach it now on the 7th, and they enter it in force the 9th. They've been building airstrips every 80 kilometers along the route. 19th Division turns toward the Irrawaddy, getting ready to cross north of Mandalay. 20th is still back trying to take Moniwa, the last enemy port on the Chindwin, and they face heavy resistance there. And this week of the war comes to an end. With advance and deception in Burma, unopposed landings on Luzon, the Allies not finishing the job in the Ardennes, the Germans not in Alsace, Monty stirring up trouble, Budapest in flames, and a giant new Soviet offensive, or offensives, on the Eastern Front, which takes Hitler by surprise. He actually sent Galen and Guderian flowers as an apology for not believing their lunatic rantings. No, he didn't. How frustrating must the last couple of weeks have been for Guderian, warning Hitler again and again and again, and being rebuffed time after time after time. Well, no sense worrying about that now, right? The Soviets have attacked and seem to be breaking through in Poland after just the first day, so no sense pointing fingers when this emergency must be addressed. Just like the last emergency, and the one before it, and the next. And many of these emergencies could likely have been avoided, or at least made less emergency. But Hitler does not listen to anyone these days, and so Guderian must go on, bouncing from crisis to crisis like a ping-pong ball in the dryer of the Second World War. Yes, that is a Dilbert reference. So the Soviets are driving into Poland again. Again? Yep, they did it a couple decades ago during the Polish-Soviet War. And we covered that, and a whole lot more, during Between Two Wars on our Time Ghost channel. You can check that out right here sometime soon. Our Time Ghost Army member of the week is David Shirley. It is the Army that allows us to produce all of our series, so join the Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. These are the newest officers in the Army. Do not forget to subscribe, and see you next time.